Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 272. In Memoriam, Muzzafar ad-Din. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm still Burt Wolder.
Oh, thank goodness. I thought my hearing was getting a little dim there. Ad-Din. Wow, this is an interesting title. I can't wait to hear what it is we have to talk about. We'll let you know right after this quick promo. The show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles272. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site where you can look around and check out the links we have. Of course, you can sign up to get email updates. You can follow us on social media. If you'd like to email us about this show or about any topic that we're covering, the email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And if you'd like to leave us an audio comment, we're always happy to hear from you. That number for calling in is 51895-22125. That's 5-1895-221-B5. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And don't forget, for as little as $1 a month on Patreon, you can support our efforts here. If you check us out on patreon.com/trifles, that will show you the options for being a patron. And we do have some lovely thank you gifts and some other perks along the way there. And please, please share the show with someone. Tell someone you care about. Well, maybe someone you don't care about the show. That'll be the ultimate act of revenge. But in the meantime, we look forward to welcoming you back in every episode here on Trifles. Well, it is time for the Master's Class. This is something we do every month in Season 6, where we look at a piece of signature Sherlockian scholarship, something that is the best of the best. And in this case, we're taking our cue from one of the entries from A Remarkable Mixture, award-winning articles from the Baker Street Journal. In this case, it is In Memoriam, Muzzafar ad-Din, by Peter Blau from volume 24, number 3 of the Baker Street Journal, which was published in September 1974. Now, Peter Blau is, or was, when he was practicing by trade, a geologist, a consulting geologist, and he uses his professional background in an attempt to identify the Mazarin Stone. Of course, the Mazarin Stone was one of the last stories in the, I think it was in the case book, if I'm not mistaken, published in 1921. And Peter makes a pretty persuasive argument here that combines history and gemology with a solid knowledge of the Sherlockian canon. And he really takes this matter of deduction to Sherlockian heights. So, Bert, where do we find ourselves at the opening of this article?
Well, we find ourselves really in two places. One is in 1974, which is where this wonderful article, In Memoriam Muzzafar ad-Din, appeared in the September 1974 Baker Street Journal. And everything you say about Peter is absolutely true. But in addition to being a geologist and a consulting geologist, he's also a journalist, a great writer, and a great Sherlockian. And if you want evidence of that, you need to no more than look at the first page of this fabulous essay, because in just a couple of brief paragraphs, Peter takes us back to the 17th century and the entire background of Mazarin. And what he tells us, is, boy, this should be an easy matter, you'd think, for a geologist to take a look at that gem that Holmes held in his hand in 1903. But boy, nothing is very simple, particularly in the canon. He tells us that Cardinal Jules Mazarin was a famous collector of diamonds. And he was born in 1602 at Pessina in the Abruzzi. And there's a link there, of course, says Peter, immediately, because it was a later Prince of Colonna who owned, and he was in the household of he had a connection to the household of Philippa Colonna. And Peter says, well, there's a connection there because there's a later Prince of Colonna who owned the Black Pearl of the Borgias. Anyway, Mazarin, educated in Rome, did some negotiations on behalf of the Pope with Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu dies, recommends Mazarin to King Louis XIII. And in that way, he enters the king's service. He was appointed after the king's death as the principal minister to Anne of Austria. He was a master of diplomacy. And then it's the cardinal's death. He becomes a cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin. It's his death that we're interested in. He dies in 1661 and bequeaths the French crown the major part of his jewel collection. Here's the point. He was a collector of gems, of course, as great cardinals would be, particularly 18 diamonds, which were known as the Mazarin diamonds. And the most famous of these were the Sancy and the Mirror of Portugal. And both of these stones, he says, have interesting histories. Now, I'll point out again that we're here after two paragraphs, two very tight paragraphs that are better written than my laborious explanation. And it's just a sample of what Peter is putting into this article.
But, Peter missed an interesting opportunity that punsters among us would love. How ironic is it that a jewel collector was named Jules? I mean, it was almost prescribed that is the path his life should have taken.
Yes, that's lovely. Years ago, there was a lovely book I have somewhere about nominative determinism. It's people whose professions are connected to their names, last names, like Joe Priest, who becomes a vicar or joins the clergy, and all of that. So that's another great example of nominative determinism. If you're American and understand the translation, of course, of Jules.
Well, it reminds me of the comedian Dennis Wolfberg, who back in the 1980s said he and his wife were expecting their first child. It was to be a daughter. And he said normally in the Jewish tradition, you name your child after a recently deceased relative, such as one of his cousins, whose name was Grandpa, or you name them after a biblical figure, like his other cousin, Snake. But in this case, his wife and he decided to name their daughter Sue, which he said was odd because for a Jew, that's usually a verb. Sorry, getting way off track here.
Well, but you didn't finish the story. She becomes a prominent attorney, of course.
There you go. Oh, and my other cousin, the philatelist, whose name was Stamp.
It's a shame about his being a philatelist. I hope his wife wasn't too distressed.
It makes me wonder if Terence Stamp ever was a philatelist. Anyway, we're getting way off topic here. So, the Mirror of Portugal, we were talking about. Yeah.
Well, anyway, we get from Peter very quickly to The Mirror of Portugal, Indian origin, weighed 25 carats, one of the crown jewels of Portugal in the 16th century. And, after the usual wars and interactions and turmoils in Europe, Queen Elizabeth I sends a fleet to Portugal, but she winds up in possession of these jewels. And the Sancy diamond, we have a description of that, worn actually by King Henry III of France in his cap. Amazing. And, on we go as to, exactly what happened to this particular Sancy diamond, which was sold in 1604 to James I of England.
Yeah, I like how it ended up there, though. According to one story, Peter writes, Sancy's faithful servant carrying the diamond to the king was attacked by robbers, but swallowed the stone before he was killed. It seems like there's echoes of the blue carbuncle in here. The diamond was recovered following an impromptu autopsy. That's what happened to the goose, isn't it?
Well, Peter leaves out a lot of details because he's a master of compression, but he should have dwelt a little bit more on the fact that it was extremely unusual for a wandering coroner to be in that part of France at the time, particularly with surgical tools. But it's quite amazing.
Wasn't that a Gilbert and Sullivan song, Wandering Coroner Eye? Anyway, he says both these great diamonds, the Mirror of Portugal and the Sancy, thus came into the possession of the British crown, but only temporarily, because, of course, we were right on the cusp of the Great Civil War at this time. And Queen Henrietta Maria, the wife of King Charles I, took the jewels to France and pledged them as a security for a loan from the Duke of Epernon. Now, she couldn't repay her debt, so the Duke sold the diamonds to Cardinal Mazarin, who of course, we already learned passed them to the French crown.
Yeah, and this goes back, of course, to the French Revolution, and then the revolutionaries found themselves in possession of the Mirror of Portugal, the Sancy, and the famous blue diamond, and many of the other jewels that consisted of the holdings of the French crown were recovered, but not these three. And it's fascinating, the history that we get into, because the blue diamond was brought from India by a merchant traveler from France and sold to Louis XIV in 1669. It was recut to 67 carats, believed to have been taken to London after the robbery and cut into 3 new stones, the largest of which is the Hope Diamond at 44 carats, now at the Smithsonian Institution.
Wow.
And, the terrible curse, Peter says, on the owners of the Hope Diamond is well known. But since it's now owned by the nation of the United States, one can only presume that the dilution of the curse among what he then counts in the 1970s as some 210 million of us, and which is now considerably more, may provide some safety for us all, he says. And to that, I would only add, not necessarily.
Well, we're going to take a quick break here while we reflect on curses, either real or imaginary, and listen to a word from this sponsor. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, as we left off last time, we were talking about the Mirror of Portugal. Where did it end up, Bert?
Yeah, well, we can get on our skates here a little bit. Basically, there are 3 stolen gems that were not recovered: the Mirror of Portugal, the Sancy, and the famous Blue Diamond. We just talked about the Blue Diamond, which was recut into 3 new stones, one of which is the Hope Diamond. So I should point out that's only perhaps a third of the curse. We shouldn't be taking all of the curse of the recutting, I don't think, onto us. And that leaves the Sancy and the Mirror of Portugal. The Sancy happens to now be owned by the Astor family, at least it was in 1974. But the Mirror of Portugal was never recovered. It did feature, by the way, in a book by Arthur Morrison, who created Martin Hewitt, says Peter. The book is The Dorrington Deed Box, written in 1897. But there's a problem here. The Mirror of Portugal was not yellow, and neither, says Peter, was the Sancy. In fact, among Cardinal Mazarin's collection of gems, the only yellow diamond was described actually as just yellowish and only 8 carats. And, Peter takes us through a variety of famous yellow diamonds with some wonderful stories. There was one, the Maximilian II at 33 carats, which wound up in New York. And in 1946, a member of the family of a New York jeweler who suspected a burglar on the premises hid the diamond in a garbage pail. And the garbage was collected, and the diamond not seen since.
My goodness.
But the answer, says Peter, we can get past all this. Let's look at the first version of this case, the Crown Diamond, which was performed as a play at the Hippodrome in Bristol in 1921. And that's been proved, of course, by James Montgomery and others to have been the predecessor of the Mazarin Stone. And in the story, Holmes says to Watson, yes, the great yellow Mazarin Stone. But in the play, Holmes says the great yellow Crown Diamond, 77 carats and without a flaw. And the play contains no mention of the cardinal or a Mazarin stone. So, says Peter, we should be looking instead for a 77-carat yellow diamond, and such a stone exists.
Now, this is where it gets fun, right? When you naturally follow the progression, when you follow the logic and map it to the facts at hand in the real world. And wink, nudge, nudge, we know how this scholarship goes. But in 1889, Peter writes, Nasir ad-Din, Shah of Persia, visited Europe, and among the souvenirs of his trip, he brought back a rather astonishing assortment of yellow South African diamonds. The crown jewels of Iran were examined by Dr. V.B. Neon in 1966, and one of the yellow diamonds, by no means the largest, measures 2.54 by 2.27 centimeters. That's almost 1 square inch, and weighs 78.96 metric carats. This is the modern carat measurement, somewhat smaller than that used in 1903, and the weight of the diamond in old carats is, wait for it, 77.05 carats. Close enough, I submit, to provide positive identification of our quarry. Ha! So Peter writes, the only mystery remaining is why the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary would show such concern over the theft of a Persian crown diamond. And here again, there's an answer. Nasir ad-Din was assassinated in 1896, and his son, Muzzafar ad-Din, was Shah of Persia from 1896 to 1907. Muzzafar ad-Din visited England in 1902 and was received by King Edward VII at Portsmouth. Later, a delegation headed by Viscount Down was sent to Persia, and in February 1903, the Shah was invested with the Order of the Garter, and a commercial treaty was signed between Great Britain and Persia as a part of continuing rivalry between Great Britain and Russia in the Persian Gulf. So, it's certainly possible that Count Negretto Silvius, or one of his confederates, was a member of the Viscount Downs delegation, and that the diamond was stolen during this official visit. Without a doubt, the British government would make every effort to avoid the embarrassment and political complications which would have resulted from failure to recover the gem.
Absolutely amazing and just beautifully done. And Peter takes us out of the story by saying, by the way, there's a book, The Crown Jewels of Iran, that includes a color photograph of the diamond in question. He says, but, now this is 1974, a personal inspection is possible because the crown jewels are on display at the National Bank of Tehran. And it's a wonderful thing. So many people have indicated their enthusiasm for the world of Sherlock Holmes by creating replicas of so many things, including replicas of the blue carbuncle. I would be very tempted to go to the National Bank in Tehran, to the gift shop, which must exist, and see if they are selling a replica of, this particular diamond. But I think there might be some difficulty to that.
Oh, I don't know. I think a Sherlockian Mecca to Iran might be just the thing that we need. Won't you get on that?
I will get on it. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's not a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
A diamond. Precious stone, but it cuts glass like it was putty.
It is more than the precious stone. It is the precious stone.